The moment the scullery maid spoke to the cold lamp, the shadows in the hall held their breath. For 10 years, Effie had tended the lamp at the top of the West Stair, a lamp with no wick, no oil, and a crystal globe that remained perpetually frosted with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. It was a fool's errand, a task given to the girl no one wanted, to keep her out of sight. But he, Lord Alaric, master of the Blackwood estate, was a creature of shadow and stillness, and he saw everything that happened in the forgotten corners of his home. He had seen her dutiful polishing, her quiet acceptance, her utter invisibility to the rest of the world. But what no one knew was that the lamp was a lock, and her decade of patient, unnoticed devotion was the key. If you believe that even the most overlooked soul has the power to change the world, type "seen" below, and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know about the cold. It was the first and last thing anyone learned about Blackwood Manor. It wasn't the damp chill of old stone, but a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the estate, from the master himself. Effie had known this cold for 10 of her 22 years. It clung to the flagstones in the kitchens, settled in the corners of the cavernous scullery, and lived, most profoundly, in the lamp she was assigned to tend. The West Stair lamp. It was a cruel joke, devised by Mrs. Gable, the housekeeper, on Effie's first day. A girl with no family, no connections, and a quietness that made people uncomfortable. She was given a rag, a stool, and a single instruction: keep the silver clean and the crystal clear. The lamp was a magnificent, useless thing, forged of blackened silver that twisted into the shapes of barren winter branches. It held a globe of crystal that never warmed. It was her entire world beyond the steam and scrape of the scullery. Every morning, before the sun had even thought of rising, she would climb the 112 steps of the servants' staircase, cross the echoing gallery, and arrive at her post. She never questioned the task. It was a reprieve. Up here, away from the clatter and the casual cruelty of the other staff, there was only silence. The silence of the West Wing, which was the domain of the master, Lord Alaric, a man no one ever saw for long, a fleeting shadow in a doorway, a low voice from the library that made the air vibrate, a presence that made every candle flame dip and shudder as he passed. The other servants spoke of him in whispers, of his strange hours, his aversion to the sun, his unsettling stillness. They said his eyes could pin a man to a wall. They said the shadows in his study moved when he was angry, pooling and stretching like living things. Effie listened, but she did not fear. It was hard to fear a man you never saw, a ghost in your own home. Her fears were smaller, more immediate. The sharp tongue of Mrs. Gable, a dropped plate, the gnawing loneliness of the dark. So she polished the cold silver. She wiped the frosted crystal, her breath misting on its surface before vanishing. Over the years, the lamp became her confidant. She didn't speak to it aloud, not at first. Her thoughts simply unspooled in its presence. She told it about the small kindness of the stable boy who saved her a bruised apple, the ache in her back after a 16-hour day, the recurring dream she had of a green field under a warm sun. The lamp listened, its cold silence a comfort. The frost on the globe seemed to thin just a little where her rag passed, a fleeting moment of clarity before it iced over again. On the first day of her 10th year of service, something was different. A tension coiled in the air of the manor, a silent hum of anxiety that even reached the scullery. Dignitaries were arriving, important men from the city, come to petition the Lord of Blackwood for some favor. The manor was being turned inside out, scrubbed and polished until it gleamed. Effie was tasked with even more work, her hands raw and red from the lye soap. But she did not neglect her lamp. That evening, as the sounds of a formal dinner party drifted up from the great hall, the distant murmur of voices, the clink of crystal, she made her usual journey. The West Stair was darker than usual. The sconces were unlit, a sign that the master was walking. Servants knew to make themselves scarce when the halls were dark. But this was her time. This was her duty. She set her stool down and began to polish, the familiar cold seeping into her fingertips. The loneliness felt sharper tonight. Downstairs, people were talking, laughing, living. Up here, there was only her, and the cold, and the dark. A wave of despair, sudden and bleak, washed over her. 10 years. 10 years of this. Of being a ghost in a house of shadows, tending a light that would never burn. For the first time, she spoke aloud, her voice a tiny, fragile thing in the immense silence. "Are you lonely too?" she whispered to the lamp, her fingers resting on the frosted globe. "To be so beautiful and so cold. To be meant for light, but to be given only darkness." She pressed her forehead against the crystal. It was like leaning against a block of ice. "I know," she murmured, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I know." And that's when it happened. The shadows at the far end of the hall did not move. They deepened. They coalesced. From the absolute black of an archway, a figure emerged, detaching itself from the gloom with an unnatural smoothness. Lord Alaric. He was taller than she'd imagined, dressed in severe, dark finery that seemed to drink the very air around him. His face was all sharp angles and pale, aristocratic beauty, framed by hair as black as a raven's wing. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They were dark, impossibly dark, and as he stepped forward, a faint crimson light sparked in their depths, like embers in a dying fire. Effie froze, her hand still on the lamp. She hadn't heard a single footstep. He moved with the silence of a hunting owl. She should have been terrified. Every instinct, every story she'd ever heard screamed at her to run, to cower. But she didn't. She simply looked at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. He stopped a few feet away. The cold in the hall intensified, pressing in on her, a physical weight. The candles in the distant gallery guttered violently, though there was no draft. "What did you say?" His voice was low, a resonance that seemed to come from the stone floor itself. It was not a question of curiosity. It was a demand. Effie swallowed, her throat dry. "My lord," she stammered, curtsying awkwardly from her perch on the stool. I did not see you." "I know you did not," he said, his gaze fixed on her, unwavering. "What did you say to the lamp?" She could not lie to him. The thought simply did not form. His eyes held hers, and she felt as if he were reading the very thoughts from her mind. I asked if it was lonely." Silence. A profound, heavy silence that stretched for an eternity. He did not mock her. He did not dismiss her. He simply watched her, and in his gaze, for the first time in her life, Effie felt seen. Truly, completely seen. Not as a scullery maid, not as a nuisance, but as a person. His crimson eyes flickered from her face to her hand, still resting on the globe of the lamp, and where her fingers touched the crystal, the frost had receded. Not just for a moment. but completely. A perfect, clear patch of glass in the shape of her handprint shone in the gloom, and from within it, a soft, impossibly faint pulse of silver light beat once, like a dying star. Lord Alaric's stillness broke. He took a single, silent step forward. "You," he breathed, the word a column of frosted air. It was not an accusation. It was a revelation. Before she could process what was happening, he was there. He reached out, not for the lamp, but for her. His hand, cool as marble but surprisingly gentle, closed around her arm. He drew her from the stool, and with an ease that defied his slender frame, he lifted her into his arms. Effie gave a small, startled gasp. She was weightless. The world tilted, a dizzying swirl of polished wood and deepening shadows. She was tucked against a chest that was hard and unyielding as stone, yet she felt no fear, only a profound sense of shock. He turned, carrying her as if she were no heavier than a doll, and began to walk down the corridor, away from the kitchens, away from the servants' quarters, away from the only life she had ever known. He was taking her toward his own private wing. Where are you taking me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked down at her, the crimson light in his eyes softer now, less like embers and more like the last rays of a dying sunset. "Up," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. "You have spent 10 years in the dark. I am taking you to the light." He carried her through halls she had only ever seen from a distance, past portraits of ancestors with eyes that seemed to follow them. The air grew colder, yet wrapped in his arms, Effie felt a strange, burgeoning warmth. The shadows here were different. They did not lurk. They flowed. They moved at the edges of her vision, stretching and welcoming, like loyal hounds greeting their master. He stopped before a set of massive oak doors, twice her height. They swung open without a sound, revealing a room that took her breath away. It was a library, but a library from a dream. Bookshelves soared to a vaulted ceiling painted with constellations. A fire roared in a hearth large enough to stand in, casting a warm, golden glow over everything. But the fire gave off no heat. It was a cold flame, dancing with silent golden light. He set her down gently in the center of a plush rug. Her worn scullery boots looked hopelessly out of place on its rich crimson surface. She stood, small and lost in the vastness of the room, while he moved to the fireplace, his back to her. "You are Effie," he stated. It was not a question. "You arrived as a child of 12. You have never been reprimanded. You have never been rewarded. You have simply been." He knew her name. The Lord of the Manor, a man who seemed more myth than mortal, knew her name. The thought sent a tremor through her. "Yes, my lord." He turned, his face illuminated by the silent flames. "That is about to change." He gestured to a small, velvet-upholstered chair near the fire. "Sit." She obeyed, perching on the edge of the cushion. He remained standing, a towering dark figure against the light. "Mrs. Gable will be dismissed in the morning," he said, his tone flat, devoid of emotion. "She mistook a jewel for a stone and left it to gather dust in a dark hallway. I do not tolerate such oversights." Effie's eyes widened. "But, my lord, it was only a lamp. It was my duty." "It is not only a lamp," he corrected her, his voice sharp with an intensity that made her flinch. He walked towards her, his steps once again silent on the thick rug. He stopped before her chair, looking down at her. That lamp, girl, is a heart, my heart, and for 300 years it has been cold and dark, encased in ice. He knelt before her. The great Lord Alaric, the feared master of Blackwood, knelt on the rug at the feet of a scullery maid. The gesture was so shocking, so utterly world-altering, that Effie could not speak. For centuries, he continued, his voice softer now, laced with a melancholy so profound it felt ancient, I have searched for someone who could warm it. Knights have tried with feats of strength, scholars with their knowledge, ladies with their beauty and their songs. They all failed. They came wanting something from me. My power, my wealth, my name. They saw the lamp as a prize to be won, a puzzle to be solved. He looked at her hands, which she had instinctively hidden in her lap. They were red, chapped, the nails broken. They never thought to simply be with it, to offer it quiet companionship, to ask if it was lonely. His crimson gaze lifted to meet hers. You did not try to light it. You did not try to understand it. You simply accepted it. You tended it. You gave it 10 years of your life without hope of reward. You gave it your compassion, and it responded. He reached out and gently took her hand, his cool fingers wrapping around hers. He turned it over, examining the calloused palm. This, he said, his voice a reverent whisper, is more powerful than any sword or any spell. This is what I have been waiting for. Effie's mind was reeling. A heart? The lamp was his heart. It made no sense, and yet, in the strange, charged atmosphere of this room, it felt like the only truth that mattered. I don't understand, she said, her voice barely audible. What do you want from me? I want you to stay, he said simply. Stay here, with me, and do for me what you did for the lamp. Tend to me. He paused, and a flicker of something vulnerable crossed his face, a crack in the marble facade. Help me feel warm again. It was an impossible request, a plea from a creature of immense power, a king in his own dark domain, to the lowest of his servants. He was offering her a place at the center of his world, a world of shadows and cold fire and ancient sorrow. To stay would be to leave behind everything she knew, which was very little, and step into an existence she could not possibly comprehend. To refuse. She could not even imagine the consequences. But as she looked into his eyes, she saw past the power, past the crimson light. She saw what she had sensed in the lamp, a loneliness so vast and so old it was breathtaking. It was a loneliness she recognized, a mirror to the quiet ache in her own soul. Would you have stayed, hearing a plea like that from a man made of shadows and sorrow? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family. And in that moment, Effie made her choice. It wasn't born of fear or of a desire for the luxury that surrounded her. It was a simple, quiet recognition. He was the lamp. She was the tender. This was a duty she understood. I will stay, she said, her voice clear and steady. A change occurred in him so subtle it was almost imperceptible. The rigid line of his shoulders softened. The oppressive cold in the room receded, replaced by a neutral stillness. The crimson in his eyes faded to a deep, dark brown. He released her hand, but his touch lingered, a phantom coolness on her skin. "Good," he said, rising to his full height. "Your old life is over. You will want for nothing. You will have rooms adjacent to mine. You will be given new clothes. You will eat at my table." The pronouncements were dizzying. From the scullery to the Lord's own wing. From scraps to a seat at his table. It was a fairy tale, but a dark one, written in ink of shadow and moonlight. In the days that followed, Effie's world was remade. Servants who had once ignored her or sneered at her now bowed their heads, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. Mrs. Gable was gone, as he had promised. Vanished without a word. A new suite of rooms was prepared for Effie, filled with soft fabrics, a canopied bed, and a wardrobe of dresses in deep, rich colors. It was overwhelming. She felt like a sparrow dressed in peacock feathers. But Alaric was patient. He seemed to understand her dislocation. He did not command her. He invited her. He invited her to the library each evening. At first, she would just sit in the velvet chair by the cold fire while he worked at his massive desk. The silence was comfortable, a shared space that felt more companionable than any conversation she'd ever had. Then, he began to speak to her. He would read passages aloud from ancient books, his voice weaving tales of forgotten kingdoms and fallen stars. He asked her questions, not about her work or her past, but about her thoughts. What did she think of the story? Did she believe in fate? What was her favorite color? No one had ever asked for her opinion on anything more important than the proper way to scour a pot. Her answers were simple, hesitant at first, but he listened with an unnerving intensity, as if her plain words were the most profound wisdom he had ever heard. One evening he found her staring at the celestial map painted on the ceiling. "Do you know the stars?" he asked, his voice coming from directly behind her. She started, not having heard him approach. "Only the North Star, my lord. To know which way is home." She paused, a sad smile touching her lips. "Not that I have one." "You do now," he said quietly. He came to stand beside her, his presence a familiar, cool weight in the air. He began to point out the constellations, telling her their ancient names and the myths behind them. He spoke of watching them shift over millennia, of seeing stars be born and die. He spoke of time in a way that made her own lifespan feel like the flutter of a mayfly's wing. It was then that she began to understand. He was not just old. He was ancient. The manor was not just his home. It was a shell he had inhabited for ages, while the world outside changed and crumbled and was reborn. He was a creature outside of time, a king of his own lonely, unchanging kingdom, a vampire king, just as the most frightened whispers had named him. The realization did not bring fear. It brought a strange, aching sadness for him. To see so much, to live so long, and to be so utterly alone. She grew bolder in her new role. She learned to walk silently, as he did. She learned to read the moods of the shadows in his study. When they were sharp and agitated, she would bring him a book of poetry. When they were soft and pooled in the corners, she would simply sit with him in silence. She was still tending to him, she realized, just in a different way. One afternoon, she pricked her finger while mending one of her new dresses. A single, perfect drop of crimson welled on her fingertip. She gasped as Alaric appeared at her side in an instant, moving faster than the eye could see. He stood over her, his body rigid, his eyes locked on the drop of blood. The crimson light flared in their depths, fierce and hungry. The cold returned to the room, sharp and biting. For the first time, a sliver of true fear pierced Effie's heart. This was the predator. This was the danger the servants whispered about. He was breathing, but it was the strained, controlled breath of a man fighting a powerful urge. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. Effie looked from the blood on her finger to the torment on his face, and her fear was replaced by a wave of compassion so strong it was a physical force. She did not pull her hand away. She did not cower. She held her hand out to him. "It is only a little," she said softly. "It does not matter." Her words, her trust, seemed to break the spell. The tension in him snapped. He let out a long, shuddering breath, and the cold receded. The hunger in his eyes was banked, replaced by a look of profound self-loathing. He took her hand, his touch impossibly gentle. He did not look at the blood. He looked at her. "It matters," he said, his voice hoarse. "To me." He raised her hand not to his lips, but to his forehead, pressing her palm against his cool skin. He closed his eyes, holding her to him as if she were an anchor in a storm. He stayed that way for a long moment, his ancient stillness suffused with a new, raw vulnerability. When he finally let her go, he reached into his coat and produced a fine linen handkerchief, carefully wrapping it around her small wound. His movements were precise, tender. "My nature is a curse," he said, his back to her once more. "It is a thirst that never ends." "A thirst is not a curse unless you let it rule you," Effie replied, her voice gaining strength. "You did not." He turned slowly, a look of astonishment on his face. No one had ever spoken to him so. No one had ever seen his battle and named it a victory. They saw only the monster, not the man inside. From that day on, something fundamental shifted between them. The last walls of formality crumbled. He showed her the night gardens, where moon-pale flowers bloomed that only opened after dusk, their scent heavy and sweet in the cool air. He told her stories of his mortal life, a life so long ago it felt like a myth even to him, and she, in turn, told him of her small, quiet life, of the mother she barely remembered, of the orphanage, of the simple dream of having a window to call her own. He listened to it all, hoarding her simple memories like treasure. One night, as a storm raged outside, rattling the window panes of the library, he found her shivering, wrapped in a blanket by the cold fire. "You are cold," he stated. "The storm," she said. "It chills the bones." He hesitated for a moment, then came and sat on the rug beside her chair. He did not touch her, but he was close enough that she could feel the stillness that radiated from him. He reached out and placed a hand on the stone hearth. The cold, silent flames in the fireplace leaped higher, grew brighter, and for the first time, a gentle, real warmth began to spill into the room. Effie stared, amazed. "How?" "Some things I have learned," he said, his eyes on the flames. "How to mimic life. But it is only a mimicry, an echo. It is not real." He looked at her, his face somber in the flickering light. "Not like the warmth you brought to the lamp. Not like the warmth you bring to this room just by being in it." Moved by an impulse she didn't understand, she reached out and laid her hand over his on the cold stone. His skin was cool, smooth as river rock, but it was not lifeless. Beneath the surface she could feel a thrum of immense contained power. He did not pull away. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. Their hands rested together on the hearthstone, her warmth against his cool, a bridge between two worlds. The fire burned brighter still. They stayed like that for hours, watching the storm, their silence more intimate than any words could ever be. Their quiet world was shattered by the arrival of Lord Malachi. He was another of their kind, a visitor from a neighboring domain. But where Alaric was stillness and shadow, Malachi was all sharp smiles and predatory grace. He moved with a restless energy, his eyes a pale, chilling blue that missed nothing. He was polite to Alaric, but his gaze lingered on Effie with an unnerving mixture of curiosity and contempt. He saw her for what she was, a mortal, a former servant, a weakness. "A new pet, Alaric," he drawled one evening, as Effie served Alaric his customary goblet of what she now knew was not wine. "A rather plain one, isn't she? I prefer mine with a bit more spirit." Alaric's hand tightened on his goblet, the crystal groaning in protest. The shadows in the room deepened. "She is not a pet," Alaric said, his voice lethally soft. "She is my companion, and you will show her the respect that title commands." Malachi merely chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Companion, you have grown sentimental in your old age. Remember what these creatures are, Alaric. They are food. They are playthings, nothing more." Effie stood her ground, her chin held high, though her heart was pounding. She would not be dismissed. She would not be shamed. "I am neither of those things," she said, her voice clear and firm. Malachi's eyebrows shot up in amusement. He turned his full attention to her. "It speaks," he said with a smirk. "Tell me, little mouse, what is it that you think you are to him?" Before she could answer, Alaric was on his feet. "Enough," he commanded, his voice cracking like a whip. The very air in the room grew heavy, oppressive. "You are a guest in my house, Malachi. Do not forget it." Malachi held up his hands in mock surrender, but his pale eye glittered with malice. He had found the chink in Alaric's armor. A few days later, Malachi cornered her in the gallery of portraits. Alaric had been called away to deal with an issue on the estate, a rare occurrence that left Effie feeling exposed. "We have not had a chance to become properly acquainted," Malachi said, stepping in front of her, blocking her path. He was smiling, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I am busy, my lord," Effie said, trying to step around him. He moved with her, a fluid, menacing dance. "He cannot protect you forever. Do you truly understand what he is? The things he has done? The oceans of blood he has spilled to achieve his age? He is a monster, and soon he will grow bored of you. He will drain you dry and toss you aside like all the others." "You are wrong," Effie said, her voice shaking but resolute. "He is not like you." Malachi's smile vanished. "Is he not?" He lunged, his speed blurring. He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "Let us see how much he truly values his little companion." He bent his head, his lips pulling back from his teeth, his fangs extending, sharp and white. Effie screamed. The sound was cut short by an explosion of motion from the end of the hall. It wasn't a man running. It was a storm, a force of nature. Alaric was there, his face a mask of incandescent fury. The crimson in his eyes was no longer embers. It was a raging inferno. He did not shout. He did not speak. He simply hit Malachi, a single, brutal blow that sent the other vampire flying down the hall to crash into the far wall with the sound of splintering wood and cracking stone. The shadows in the hall erupted. They surged from the corners, from beneath the tapestries, from Alaric himself, coalescing into tangible, writhing tendrils of pure darkness. They swarmed over Malachi, holding him down, silencing his cries of rage and pain. Alaric did not spare him another glance. He was at Effie's side in a heartbeat, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her. "Did he harm you?" he asked, his voice a raw, ragged thing, thick with a violence he was barely containing. "No," she whispered, her eyes wide with shock and a fierce, soaring pride. "You came." "Always," he vowed, his gaze burning into hers. He gently took her wrist, where the imprint of Malachi's fingers was already beginning to bruise. His touch was cold, but it soothed the ache. He turned his burning gaze back to the struggling form pinned by the shadows. "You defiled my home," Alaric said, his voice echoing with centuries of command. "You threatened what is mine." He walked towards Malachi, the shadows parting before him. He was no longer the quiet, melancholic scholar. This was the Vampire King, a being of absolute power and terrifying purpose. Effie did not hide. She did not run. She straightened her shoulders and walked to stand beside him. She would not be a damsel to be rescued and then set aside. This was her fight, too. Her presence at his side was a declaration, and Alaric felt it. He glanced at her, and his furious expression softened for a fraction of a second. An acknowledgement. A partnership. In front of the pinned and helpless Malachi, in front of the cowering servants who had gathered at the sound of the crash, Alaric turned to Effie. He took her bruised hand and lifted it to his lips, kissing the back of it with a formal, courtly grace that was a stark contrast to the violence of the moment. "Effie is the lady of this house," he announced, his voice ringing through the hall, a proclamation of iron and will. "She is my consort. Her word is my word. Her safety is my own. Anyone who shows her disrespect answers to me." He looked down at Malachi, his eyes glowing with cold fire. "You will leave now. You will tell everyone what you have seen. You will tell them that Blackwood has a queen." He gestured, and the shadows released their captive. Malachi scrambled to his feet, his handsome face contorted with hate and humiliation. He gave Effie one last, venomous look before he vanished, a blur of motion down the corridor. The servants stared, their faces a mixture of terror and awe. They had seen their master's power before, but they had never seen its purpose. Now they knew. The little scullery maid, the invisible girl, was the center of his world, the one thing he would protect with all the terrible force at his command. Alaric turned back to Effie, the fury draining from him, leaving him looking weary and ancient. "Come," he said softly, taking her hand. "Let us go back to the library." As they walked away, hand in hand, a servant girl at the back of the crowd whispered to another, "Did you see his eyes? He looked at her, like she was the sun." Later that night, as they sat in their usual chairs by the fire, Effie noticed something. From her seat, she could just see the top of the West Stair. A soft, silver light was emanating from the landing. It pulsed gently, a steady, calm, and wonderfully warm glow that pushed back the deepest shadows in the hall. The lamp was lit. His heart was warm. A year passed, a year of quiet days and long, companionable nights. Effie was no longer a sparrow in peacock feathers. She was the lady of Blackwood Manor, and she wore the title with a quiet grace and strength that commanded more respect than any noble title ever could. She was kind to the staff, fair in her judgments, and she ruled the domestic heart of the manor with a gentle hand, freeing Alaric to manage the vast, ancient concerns of his domain. She brought life back to the cold halls, not with parties or loud music, but with small things. Flowers in vases, the scent of baking bread from the kitchens, a request he had found strange but granted instantly, the sound of her humming as she read by the fire. Each was a small stitch, mending the 300-year-old tear in the soul of the house. He, in turn, cherished her. He had the night gardens expanded, filling them with every pale, fragrant flower that had ever bloomed under the moon. He taught her languages from books that had turned to dust centuries ago. He showed her the world, not by traveling, but through his memories, sharing visions of ancient Rome, of Renaissance Venice, of the wild, untouched forests that had stood before cities were ever built. He never hid his nature from her again. She learned his rhythms, the nights he needed to hunt in the forests that bordered the estate, the profound stillness that followed. She never feared him. She would wait for him in the library, a book in her lap, and when he returned, a darkness clinging to him like a shroud, she would simply look up and smile. Her smile was enough to banish any shadow. One evening, as they sat on a marble bench in the moonlit garden, he took her hand. His touch was still cool, but it was a familiar comfort now. "Effie," he began, his voice serious, "there is a conversation we have not had." She knew what it was. The question had been a silent guest in their lives for months, the unassailable fact of her mortality. She was a flickering candle flame next to his eternal, cold star. "I am getting older," she said simply, without sadness. "Every day." "And I am not," he finished. "I have watched generations of humans live and die. I have watched empires rise and fall. The thought of watching you fade, it is the only thing I have ever truly feared." He looked at her, his dark eyes, so rarely showing the crimson light anymore, filled with a deep and painful love. "I can offer you what I have, time without end, an existence here, with me, forever." He paused, his grip on her hand tightening. "It is a curse, Effie. It is a cold, lonely existence, and I would not wish it on you. But the thought of an eternity without you is a far greater curse." He was offering her immortality, the gift that so many had craved, had killed for. He was offering it to her not as a prize, but as a choice, laden with sorrow and truth. Effie looked at their joined hands, her warm, living skin against his pale, ageless flesh. She thought of the sun, which she missed some days. She thought of growing old, a path she had always assumed was hers to walk. Then she looked at his face, at the ancient soul who had looked at a forgotten girl and seen a queen. He had not offered her a life of ease. He had offered her himself, his truth, his heart. "You once told me that a thirst is not a curse unless you let it rule you," she said softly, echoing her own words from so long ago. "Perhaps an eternity is not a curse either, if you do not have to face it alone." A slow, beautiful smile transformed his face, a sight so rare it was like watching a solar eclipse. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "Is that your answer?" he whispered. She leaned in and pressed a gentle kiss to his cool lips. It was her first. It was his first in centuries. It tasted of moonlight and old books and a love that defied time itself. "Ask me again in 50 years, she said against his mouth, a teasing light in her eyes. "Let me have my life. Let me have my seasons. And when winter comes for me, I will be ready for a new spring with you." He let out a low laugh, a sound of pure joy that seemed to make the very stars shine brighter. He pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe. "As my lady wishes," he murmured into her hair. 50 years, or 100. I have waited 3 centuries for you. I can wait a little longer." And they sat there, in their garden of moonlight and memory, a mortal woman and her immortal king, their 2 lonely hearts finally, and forever, warm. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers ancient loneliness, and where being truly seen becomes the greatest power of all, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.